I believe everybody, Patty, can learn how to help someone who is in suicidal crisis. And even if you're not versed in the exact way to ask the question or the exact way to do all the things that we train to do, at least you're somebody who reaches out and has compassion for those who are thinking about suicide or have attempted suicide or have thought about it for a long time.
Welcome to In the Shadows, where we shed light on difficult issues right here in our community. I'm Patty Lemons. In part 1 of this episode, we learned from Dr. Mike Ferguson how and when to seek help and why people choose to take their own lives. Today we continue that conversation and learn how to responsibly address the topic with a loved one and when we should take suicide threats seriously. Dr. Ferguson, can you tell us how, for many years when somebody died by suicide, nobody really wanted to talk about it, but now we're bringing more and more awareness to the topic. Explain how that's evolved and how that's helping us.
As a suicidologist in the field and working in every day with helping people get beyond suicide ideology and gestures and potential attempts, I find there's a lot of shame that's involved, not only with the person who is attempting or who has completed, the family has that as well. And I wish I could say, Patty, that we have made large strides to breaking the silence of suicide and talking about it. And I think, there are a lot more media attention given to it. There's a lot more things that are happening to cause us to talk about it. I know that every time there is an actor or an actress's death related to suicide, the calls to the support lines go up a lot, that there is a lot more discussion about it. And so I feel like that's very good. But at the same time, as someone who is trying to train millions of people on how to understand the signs and symptoms of suicide and the process of suicide, and one of my main goals is to help families and just really everyday people understand how to help someone who is suicidal, I find that there is a real caution about wanting to talk about it. For instance, I know that right now our schools are kind of struggling, our high schools are kind of struggling with what to do with this topic. And I've been called by many principals across the nation who have had a recent suicide in their community, and they're looking for information and they want to try to give resources to the high school, but the one thing they don't want to do is they don't want to talk about it too much because they're afraid of suicide contagion, which is if one student dies by suicide, then there is going to be others who die by suicide. And that does happen. Sadly, it does. Especially when, like a Robin Williams, when he ends up taking his life, people who are vulnerable already think, wow, if he's got all this money and all this fame, all this stuff, and he doesn't feel like his life is worth much, who am I? Because they might be sitting, in their basement or in front of their computer and their life is hard. So if Robin Williams needs to do it, I guess I do too. And so the American Association of Suicidology has given very strict guidelines about how to report on suicides. And we have a lot of discussion about it through newspapers or different things, but we don't hear a lot about suicide. And it's not something that I feel personally as a suicidologist that has yet been able to be something that's talked about. And I think we need to put a lot more effort, but the gatekeepers of many organizations and different businesses and companies and places struggle because they're not sure that if we talk about suicide, will it cause someone who's vulnerable to seek suicide? And so I think we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to opening up this discussion about it.
Yeah, and as we're talking about this, that same thought actually crossed my mind. How do we responsibly address this without bringing it to the forefront in the minds of those who are already at risk?
Well, one of the myths of suicide discussion is that if I ask somebody if they are thinking about killing themselves, or if they think, are you thinking about dying by suicide? Are you thinking about suicide? The common myth is if I ask them that question, and I suspect that they are, that I'm going to put that idea in their mind. And that has been proven wrong for all the many years of suicidology. And it is completely not true. And so what we understand and what research informs us in practice is that when we ask somebody if they're thinking about killing themselves or they're thinking about dying by suicide, what ends up happening is they feel relief because someone is actually understanding and wants to know, and they're wanting to tell somebody. Because what we understand, and I do psychological autopsies as a suicidologist, and what we basically do, it's an emotional postmortem, looking at a person's life 30 days, 7 days, and a day before their suicide death. And from that comes all the research that we're able now to bring to the suicide prevention intervention community and say, here's the signs and here's the symptoms. And if you get this sense that someone is thinking about suicide, the best thing you can do in saving a life is ask them, are they thinking about suicide? And in doing so, that deflates completely this person's desire to want to do it.
The series 13 Reasons Why on Netflix. Have you seen it, and do you have an opinion about it?
I have seen it, and I have talked to a lot of people across the nation and different places that I've trained, and a lot of different college students and high school students. One thing that I do hear a lot from the high school students that I talk to in different places is that it is a good replication of high school life, which as a parent of 2 adult kids now, it kind of scares me in relationship to that. But at the same time, some of the scenes and some of the things that are brought up in 13 Reasons Why might need to be challenged somewhat by society, or at least by those who produce it. But I can't deny the fact that 13 Reasons Why did start a conversation. And that conversation, to me, is a very healthy one. And I'm not afraid to go there, and sadly, I think a lot of people are. And I wish we'd go there more often because I think we could reduce suicide by talking about it. I am not an advocate that if you have teens that you should let them watch it on their own. I think if they're going to watch 13 Reasons Why, you as a parent or a mentor of a student or an adult, sit and watch that with them and then process what they see. And so I think that's probably what I would encourage people to do with that particular series.
You mentioned you have young adults in your family, so you can understand the worry that some parents have. What do you say to those parents who have a loved one, whether it's their children or their brothers or sisters or even a spouse, who they just don't want to seek help?
It is a very frightening thing and scary, upsetting issue when a parent has a son or daughter who they know is in some kind of either acute suicidal crisis or struggling with some kind of mental health issue or going through some kind of emotional crisis. And I can't even imagine what all those parents, and I talk to them every day, and they are facing just an incredible amount of overwhelming feelings because they want to keep their loved one safe. At the same time, I think the families of those who do not want to seek help still have to be continually proactive and to potentially learn how to work with someone who might be chronically suicidal, someone that might be acutely suicidal, and really know how to understand the signs and understand the behaviors, because in our field in psychology, behaviors communicate. And so it's important for all of us, and that's why I'm a very strong advocate of what they call gatekeeper training in suicide, and that is training the everyday person who, because suicide prevention can be everybody's business, as they say in some circles. And so training parents to know how to be able to recognize these signs and then to ask the questions. And I know that our research has shown that even though a young adult or someone in their family who doesn't want to seek help, to get help, that they are encouraged and are hopeful that someone at least in their family is asking about their suicidal tendencies. So my recommendation for parents who are dealing with that is to be able to learn how to help someone who is in an acute or chronic suicidal condition.
And how do we learn to do that?
I think I know that there's a lot of different programs here in Springfield that offer what they call gatekeeper training, and that would be QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer. And then, of course, there's adult mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid that is being done by several of the organizations in our community. But I think also we're beginning to see, and the research has supported it over the last 5 years, is that we're seeing a lot of online training now available. And that's really the kind of training that I provide, is an online training, and it's a certificate training for people to know how to be someone who can help somebody in acute suicidal crisis.
That sounds like something that a lot of parents would be interested in. Can you tell us how to find out more information?
Absolutely. In fact, I believe everybody, Patty, can learn how to help someone who is in suicidal crisis. And even if you're not versed in the exact way to ask the question or the exact way to do all the things that we train to do, at least you're somebody who reaches out and has compassion for those who are thinking about suicide or have attempted suicide or have thought about it for a long time. Because what I find is that a lot of people have they have anger at people who think about suicide. How can you think about leaving us? How can you think about whatever, instead of looking at them with compassion? So it truly is my passion to train hundreds and thousands of people in doing suicide prevention and intervention, and anyone can do that. And I know here the Community Partnership of the Ozarks, they are doing youth mental health first aid and also adult mental health first aid. And they provide trainings in different locations. And I know that there are other organizations, and I can't say that I know a whole lot more that's doing that other than CPO, Community Partnership of the Ozarks. But you can also come to my website, which is drmikeferguson.com, and you can I have a couple of ebooks that I produce. One is a quick reference guide for helping those in acute suicidal crisis, and it's just about 26 pages, and it just provides a lot of information on what questions should I ask, what should I look for, what are the signs, what are the symptoms, if I want to learn more, where do I go? And that can be got there. And then also, I think it's important that we also train people what happens after a suicide attempt. So what does the family do with someone who has tried to complete suicide? Now they're coming home, or they're going back to their home or family. And so what do we need to do after that? So how do we make sure that they stay alive? Because what we understand from research is that those who have attempted suicide are at greater risk than those who have not attempted. So we have to be concerned, but I really believe everybody can learn how to help someone who's in a suicidal crisis.
I think that's all really good information. In one of our earlier episodes, Mary Jane, Sam's mom, she mentioned that she feels like kids turn to their friends before they would turn to an adult. So I think that would be great information for peers to see. What advice do you have for peers?
The advice I have for peers who have friends who come to them and confide in them, and I do agree with Mary Jane that most high schoolers will turn to their best friend at school before they'll even tell their parent, or they'll even tell a teacher or counselor or anybody. And oftentimes, the population that is overlooked in this training are the peers. And I use, as part of my training program across the nation, a program called Signs of Suicide, SOS. And in this case, you're not bringing the full breadth of suicide intervention to a team, but you're giving them specific directions on, if someone says to them, I'm thinking about killing myself, or they're passively saying, I'd like to go to sleep and just not wake up tomorrow, what does that student do? Where should they go? And there's 4 different pieces of information that are in that Signs of Suicide program. And there's videotapes, DVDs that we can show, and we give them role plays and know how to respond and how not to respond. But I think that's a population that in the suicide prevention training world is not being looked at. But I think it has a lot to do, obviously, with the topic itself. And yet, those peers can be a great part of helping someone get through a suicidal crisis.
Do you think sometimes people look at that as a cry for attention, or do you think that we need to take all those statements seriously?
Our particular approach in suicidology and in our training is that we need to take every suicide ideation, discussion, talk seriously. And I have a lot of families who will text me, or they will message me or call and say, I just think, my 14-year-old daughter, she mentions suicide all the time, and I just think she needs attention or is wanting attention. So I always ask the parents, I said, well, if she needs attention, go ahead and give it to her. If that's what you think her suicide gestures are, and so don't overlook it. But oftentimes parents and friends are not wanting to reinforce that same behavior. So what ends up happening is they don't take it serious. So our particular philosophy in suicidology is to train everybody to take every suicide passive or aggressive statement or action seriously, and then just try to understand. Because, like I said before, behavior communicates. And the idea is that someone who is acting out with some acute suicidal crisis or signs and symptoms, they do need attention, and we need to understand what's happening in their life.
Do you have any tips for helping people work through stressful situations, whether it's been a death in the family or the loss of a job? Do you have any tips for managing anxiety or just helping people get through that?
Yes, I do have a lot of tips, Patty, and I'm not sure we have enough time to go through all of those, because part of my philosophy and part of my guiding values after being in this field for so long is, and I have had the opportunity to not only become a trained psychologist and suicidologist, but one of the things that I strongly believe that should be a part of our mental health treatment is not just to let somebody come and give us their narrative, give us their story, walk us through the crisis you had. But I think we have to include what I term psychoeducation, and meaning that we need to be able to give people the ability to cope with what it is they're dealing with in the moment. I know that we have all types of therapy to help people with all kinds of problems. We have cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalytical therapy, we have client-centered, we have dialectical behavioral therapy, and I think that's one of the things that is helpful when you go online to look for information. You can look at all those different types of therapies and what those involve, and if you're looking for a therapist, is to ask what kind of therapy approach they take. That's a very valid question. But at the same time, there are hundreds of coping strategies. And so for me personally as a psychologist in my mental health coaching practice, I do more coping strategies training than I do about let's go back in the past and dig up all that's there. Because right now you're being bothered by this, and so I take a solution-focused approach. And so a good example of a coping strategy, and personally I like to use metaphors. And so one of the things that I do is I talk about when someone is dealing with a lot of emotional crisis that they don't want people to know or to understand about or talk about, is they are standing in a pool with water up, say, just above their waist. And so you're trying to enjoy the swim, but then someone comes along and throws in this overinflated beach ball and says, okay, for the next 2 hours, I want you to take this beach ball and hold it underwater as long as you can. And so you do that, and of course we all know physics. It's not possible to hold a beach ball underwater that long without wearing yourself out. But then someone else comes along, life does, throws another beach ball in, and now you've got two trying to, and you become wore out and you become tired. When what I like to help people do in that scenario is to just let go of those beach balls and just enjoy the swim. So they can drop the struggle. And so in this particular example, it's all about just being able to radically accept that I know I'm going through something, and right now that's okay. I don't have to be perfect. It's okay not to be okay. So that's one example of hundreds that we could give to help people to get through the process of working through anxiety or depression or any kind of issue that they're facing.
I understand you have a phone number that people can text if they're in crisis, and I think that's a really great service, especially with younger people. They're probably more likely to text than to call. Why did you decide to do that, and can you tell us the phone number?
I decided to do, in fact, focus most of my practice on the use of technology for a couple of reasons. My wife and I spent 20 years in New York City working with at-risk teens. And one of the things that we realized is that we wanted to walk with them through life. And in doing that, we were able to help them in greater ways than just having them come once a week to an after-school program. And so how text counseling or crisis text line came to be for me, as a professor of psychology at a university, I decided, this is probably 4 years ago, to put in my syllabus a text number. Because I had been following sort of how the millennials have been progressing and their use of technology, and I came to be surprised that most teens will text 4,000 texts a month. And I'm like, wow, they're spending all these hours on their smartphones. And so what I said to the students, and I put in my syllabus for this class, was a text number that I had gotten off of Google Voice, basically. And I said, if you guys have a question about an assignment, if you have something going on, text me on that number, and then I can immediately respond, and that way you can get to it quicker. And so we went through about half a semester, and I got a lot of texts from students. Okay, how many pages is this? When is this due? That kind of stuff. But one evening, as I was about ready to kind of relax for the evening, I got a text, and I looked at my phone, and it was a text of a young man who I didn't recognize at the time. He was not actually in my class, but the number was given to him by a student in my class. And the student said, hey, you need to text Dr. Ferguson and talk to him. So that night, I got a text from a young man who was sitting in a recliner in an apartment. He had a bottle of vodka on his lap, along with a 9mm handgun. And he texted me that picture, and he said, Dr. Ferguson, my girlfriend just broke up with me. I am out of state here at college, and I don't know what to do, but I do know I don't want to live anymore. And then that night, him and I text for over 2.5 hours. In fact, on our crisis text line, most of our text conversations with teens from across the nation uh, last more than 90 minutes. And so because they're texting and, just doing other things. I mean, we've had teens. I had a 14-year-old female who texted our text line. And of course, we use acronyms sometimes for things we text. And so she had put PIR in the text. And I happened to be on the shift that night. And I admittedly didn't know what PIR meant. PIR meant. And so what happened was I had to look it up. And when I looked it up, it said parent in the room. And so here I am texting with a 14-year-old young lady whose mom is sitting in the same room she's texting this crisis text line, because she didn't feel comfortable telling her mom that I feel like my life needs to be over. And so I began to realize from that text, from that college syllabus experience, I said, we can reach teens who text all the time. So we did a pilot for about 2 years with the Google Voice, and then we finally began to launch higher and greater our expanse, be able to pull more people in. And so we started the Teen Text Crisis Line, which is something anybody in the nation can text. And the number is 855-449-1212. And so I know our text line is available from 3 to midnight, 7 days a week. But there also is a national text line that I worked with as a clinical director on many years ago. And their number, and they're 24/7, based out of New York. And their number is 741-741. And so any teen, any young adult, any adult can text either one of those numbers and find somebody who is trained to be someone who's a suicide interventionist to help them work through the suicide they're facing.
So I understand you have a personal cell number that you're willing to share. Is that for those in Springfield, or is that for anyone?
It's really for anybody, Patty. And the reason we talked earlier about if a family, isn't able to support somebody that is facing a mental health crisis and that person doesn't really know where to go, it's very hard to figure out, okay, do I need to see a counselor? Do I need to see a doctor? What's going on? And so I began to realize that accessibility was a real challenge for anyone facing a mental health crisis. And so I took and added to my own personal mental health crisis coaching practice my number, and it's a number that's based in Springfield, but it can be accessed all over the nation. And that number is 417-501-9662. And I do get a lot of texts from people who are just trying to figure out where should I go? What should I do? Who should I see? And so I think that's a very good approach. If you really don't know where to go and what to do, text me on that number, and I'll be glad to listen, help, give some direction, do whatever I can to give you some guidance on what to do next.
The main reason I wanted to start this podcast was to learn how all of us in the community can work together to help make a dent in this problem. Do you have any final words for us?
There's a lot of things we can do in our community, Patty, that would help us very much, I think, lower suicide rates in our community, among our teens, among our adults. And I think it really takes a collaboration of a lot of different partners. I know that our NAMI office here is fighting and working hard to bring attention to this issue. I would love to see our schools become attached to that. I know there are some support groups that are happening in our community, but I think probably the one thing that needs to be talked about is, and I wish I could say that suicide prevention or intervention was rocket science, but it really isn't. It's knowing how to listen non-judgmentally and learning how to ask the right kinds of questions. And even if you get those messed up a little bit, it still helps. But just being able to validate someone's feelings. And so I am a firm believer that everybody and anybody can learn how to help somebody who is facing a suicidal crisis or really just going through a hard time. I'm a person who believes, I'm developing training now to help. The term could be lay counseling, but the idea is friend to friend. Training people how they could sit over lunch or sit across the desk from, or they're on a long trip and this person's opening up their heart. So what could I do to better listen and better provide resources and help? And it is a lot about just being there for that person and being able to say to them, it's okay not to be okay, and to be a safe place. So I am a person who strongly believes our community, hundreds and thousands of people from our community, could literally learn how to help somebody in an emotional crisis, but also in a suicidal crisis, and do it, and maybe not be a professional at it, but can do it with success.
Dr. Ferguson, thank you so much for being here. This is all wonderful information, and I think everybody is going to learn a lot from it. We're very fortunate to have you here.
Yep. Thank you, Patty, so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Shadows. We have just one episode left in our mental health and suicide series, and our last story is one of hope. You'll hear from Carly, who's on her road to recovery after some aggressive suicidal thoughts. We'll also hear from Carly's mom, who shares the impact that the experience has had on her family.
Because how do you tell the people around you that you're going without hurting them? Because I didn't want to hurt anyone when I went. I wanted everyone to have closure. That's why I wrote the note. I wasn't writing the note to blame anyone. It wasn't for any reason other than to give people closure, because I didn't get closure. All I got was the blame. And so I wanted to at least give people peace of mind before I passed. And I was certain that I was going to pass. I was certain that there was no future ahead of me.
In the Shadows is currently looking for sponsors to keep this project going. Please visit intheshadowspod.com for more information and to subscribe to this podcast series. You can also subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, or YouTube. Help us educate and change the statistics in our community by sharing this podcast on social media. If you need immediate help, please call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255, or you can text the crisis helpline at 741-741. In Springfield, Missouri, you can also send a text to Dr. Mike Ferguson, psychologist, suicidologist, and mental health coach at 417-501-9622. And on our final note, please remember to be kind to everyone. We don't know what challenges others are facing on any given day, and a smile from you could turn their world around.